Uncle Dung put one hand on Jack's shoulder. "I'm building this house for your mother. Don't tell her yet." Jack went very still. The cicadas in the trees stopped existing for a moment. The afternoon sun was hot on the back of his neck. He looked at the older man, the man who had stood beside his father's coffin 4 years ago and not said one word the entire funeral. The man who had driven Mrs. Ly to the doctor every month since her husband died. The man who had never once in 30 years used the word love out loud. Bach. Jack's voice came out softer than he meant it. "Are you serious?" "I have never been more serious in my life." Tu Tien was sitting on the porch of Uncle Ding's farmhouse 20 meters away. She could not hear the conversation. She was watching Jack's back. She could tell from the way Jack's shoulders had dropped that something had just shifted. She did not stand up. She waited. 3 hours earlier, Uncle Dung had called Jack and asked him to come over. There had been no urgency in his voice, just the usual quiet politeness of an old farmer asking a favor. Jack had assumed it was about acacia trees or rice harvest schedules. Tu Tien had come along because leaping at the farm and Uncle Dung always made the best tea. Now Jack was standing in the middle of a 4,000 square meter plot of newly purchased land on the high side of the hill, and Uncle Dung had just said the words Jack had been afraid of for 2 years. "You want me to design it," Jack said. "I want you to design it. I want you to build it. I want every wall and every window to come from your hands. Not because I cannot afford another architect, I can, but because if this house is for your mother, then her son's heart should be in it." Jack did not know what to say. He looked out over the land. From up here, you could see 3 valleys. The wind moved through the rice fields below like an invisible hand brushing fur. To the east, the morning sun would rise directly into a bedroom window. To the west, every sunset would land on a kitchen. "Does she know?" Jack said. "No." "When are you going to tell her?" "When the house is finished, not before. If she says no, I will keep the house anyway. I will live in it alone. I am 68 years old, Jack. I do not have time for slow." If you've made it this far into the first minute, type the word house in the comments below. I want to see who is watching this love story from the very beginning, because by the end of this video, none of us are going to be the same. That night, Jack drove home with Tu Tien beside him in the truck. He had not told her yet. He was waiting for the right moment, the way Uncle Dung was waiting for the right moment with his mother. Tu Tien noticed his silence. "Jack, yes, you're driving 20 kilometers under the speed limit. What is in your head?" Jack pulled the truck over to the shoulder of the road. The engine hummed. The rice fields whispered. He turned to look at her in the dim green glow of the dashboard light. "Bok Dung asked me to design a house on the new land, up on the hill." "That is wonderful." "Tu Tien, he is building it for my mother." Tu Tien did not speak for a long moment. She just looked at Jack. Then her face broke open into something he had not seen on her in weeks. A real smile, full, the kind of smile Tu Tien only gave when something in the universe was finally going right. "Jack." She took his hand. "Jack, he loves her. For how long do you think?" "I do not know, but long enough to wait until your father had been gone 4 years and not say one word before." Jack closed his eyes. He thought about every memory of Uncle Dung, the man at every birthday, the man who had taught Jack to ride a bicycle when his father was away on business, the man whose hand had stayed on Mrs. Ly's shoulder for 3 full seconds at the funeral. 3 seconds? Jack had counted at the time without understanding why he was counting. "All those years," Jack said quietly, "all those years he was beside us, and I never saw it. Because he never let you see it." They drove home slowly. The moon was full over the rice fields. When they got back to the farm, La was already asleep in the small room next to theirs. The dog Mew was curled at her feet. The whole house smelled of the dried meat Uncle Dung had given them 3 days ago. Tu Tien fell asleep before Jack did. Jack lay awake for a long time staring at the ceiling. Then he got up quietly, took his sketchbook, and went out to the porch. He sat under the moonlight and began to draw. He drew until the sun came up. In the morning, he drove back to the land alone. He brought a measuring tape, a clipboard, 3 pencils, and a small folding stool. He walked every corner of the 4,000 square meters. He noted the slope of the ground. He marked the position of 3 large old trees that should not be cut down. He watched where the morning shadow fell at 7 a.m. and where the afternoon shadow fell at 4 p.m. Behind a low stone wall at the back of the property, half hidden by tall grass, he found something he had not expected: a frangipani tree, old, maybe 40 years old, maybe more. The trunk was thick and twisted, the kind of trunk a tree only grows when it has been left alone for a very long time. White flowers with yellow centers were scattered on the ground beneath it. Jack stood very still. His mother had once told him a story when he was a boy. She had said that before she married his father had planted a frangipani tree for her on a piece of land they had once dreamed of buying together. The land deal had fallen through. The tree was never visited. His father had told the story exactly once and never again. Jack walked closer to the tree. He touched the bark. Old, older than him. Definitely older than the 4 years his father had been dead. He pulled out his phone. He called Uncle Dung. "Buck, I'm at the land. There is a frangipani tree behind the stone wall." A silence on the other end of the line. Long. "Yes," Uncle Dung said finally. "Did you plant it?" Another silence. "Yes. When?" 35 years ago, the year before your mother married your father." Jack lowered the phone slowly. His hand was shaking. He sat down on the folding stool. The frangipani flowers were small and white and slightly bruised where they had fallen on the grass. He picked one up and turned it over in his fingers. "If this story is pulling at you the way it's pulling at me, do me one favor: subscribe and turn on the bell." Because what Jack finds out next about his mother's past changes how he sees his entire childhood. That afternoon, Jack drove back to the village 6 hours north. He did not tell Tu Tien where he was going. He did not tell Uncle Dung. He drove straight to his mother's house and parked at the gate and walked up the dirt path and knocked once. Mrs. Ly opened the door. She was wearing the same dark blouse she always wore. Her hair was tied back. Her rosary was looped around her wrist. When she saw Jack, her face went pale. "What is wrong? What happened?" "Nothing happened, May. I just came to see you." She let him in. She poured tea. They sat across from each other at the small wooden table where Jack had eaten every meal of his childhood. Lucy watched him over the rim of her cup. "Jack." "Yes, Mishi, you did not drive 6 hours to come see me with no reason. What is in your head, Con?" Jack put his cup down. "Mishi, before you married Bijou, did you ever almost marry someone else?" Mrs. Laoshi did not answer immediately. She set her own cup down very carefully. She wiped her hands on the cloth on the table. She looked out the window for a long moment. "Why are you asking me this?" "Because I am designing a house, Mia. And on the land where I am designing it, there is a frangipani tree that is 35 years old. And it was planted there 1 year before you married Bibia. And it was not planted by Bibia." "Mrs. Inc." Li's hand went still on the table. "Whose land is the house being built on?" she said quietly. "Bak Dong's land." The silence in the kitchen was so complete that Jack could hear the cicadas in the back garden. "Miche." Jack reached across the table. He took her hand. It was cold. "Miche, I am not angry. I am not anything. I just want to know." Mrs. Lachey closed her eyes. Her rosary moved one bead between her fingers without her seeming to notice. "I was 22, she said. Your father had not yet returned from his work in Saigon. Ding was already farming. He came to my parents' house 3 times to ask for permission to marry me. My father said no every time. Ding was poor. Your father was not." She opened her eyes. They were wet. "I did not know about the tree. He planted it on land you and Bibi had talked about buying. That land was Bibi's idea. I never even saw it." Mrs. Libby paused, but Dean must have known. He must have gone there alone. He must have planted the tree there knowing we would never come. "Ma, he has waited his entire life." Mrs. Litchi pulled her hand back from Jack's. She put both hands over her face. She did not cry. She just held them there for a long time. "Why are you telling me this now, Con?" "Because Bok Dung is building you a house on that land. And he asked me to design it, and he asked me not to tell you." Mrs. Litchi's hands came down slowly from her face. She looked at her son for a long moment. Then she did something Jack had not seen her do since the day his father was buried. She smiled. It was a small smile. It barely moved her lips, but it was real. "Your father was a good man, Mrs. Bang," Lishi said quietly. "I loved him. I built a family with him. I do not regret one day of my life with him." She paused. "But Jack, your father would have wanted me to be happy after he was gone. And Ding has been my friend for 40 years. He has carried me through this last year when I could not carry myself." Jack waited. "Do not tell him I know," she said. "Let him finish the house. Let him come to me when he is ready. I will pretend to be surprised." "Ming." "Yes. Are you sure?" "I am sure, Con." She took his hand again. Her hand was warm now. "And Jack, when you design the bedroom window, make it face east. Your father always said the morning sun is the only thing in the world that does not lie." Jack drove back to the farm that night in silence. He arrived at 3 in the morning. Tu Tien was awake. She was sitting on the porch with a cup of tea, the way she always did when she could not sleep. She did not ask where he had been. Jack sat down beside her. He took her hand. He did not speak for a long time. "My mother is going to be happy," he said finally. Tu Tien squeezed his hand. 3 days later, Jack finished the design. He worked on it every night, all night, until the lamp ran out of oil and he had to switch to candles. The house was small. The house was simple. The house had a wooden frame and a sloped roof and large glass panels facing east, and a small garden where his mother could plant whatever she wanted. The bedroom window faced east. When he presented the model to Uncle Ding, the older man did not speak for almost a full minute. He just looked at the small wooden house in front of him. He touched the roof with one finger. He touched the veranda. He touched the bedroom window facing east. Then he looked up at Jack. "Jack." Uncle Dung's voice was rougher than Jack had ever heard it. "How did you know to put the bedroom window on the east side?" "Buck, your mother. Your mother told me 20 years ago that her favorite thing in the world was the morning light. She said it twice. I never forgot. But you, how did you know?" Jack did not answer. Uncle Ding's eyes filled with water. He turned away. He wiped his face with the back of his sleeve. He walked over to the window of the farmhouse and looked out at the rice fields for a long moment. When he turned back, his eyes were dry again. "When can construction begin?" he said. "Next week, Bok. Good." That evening, Jack drove home and showed the model to Tu Tien on the porch. She turned it slowly in her hands under the warm lamplight. She admired the wooden frame and the small garden space and the way every detail had been thought through. Then she looked at the bedroom window facing east, and she looked up at Jack, and her eyes were wet. "Jack." "Yes, you showed this to your mother." "How did you know?" "Because the east-facing window is not in your usual design language. Someone told you, and there is only one person it could have been." Jack smiled. He had married someone who could read him like a clean page. That night, after Tu Tien had gone to sleep, Jack stepped outside one more time. He sat on the porch and looked at the moon. His phone vibrated in his pocket. A message from his mother. He opened it. It was 3 words. Con, Cecen. Jack closed his eyes. He held the phone against his chest for a moment. But underneath the message, in the same conversation, his mother had sent something else. A photograph. He had not noticed it at first. He opened the photograph. It was a picture of a small wooden box. The box was sitting on Mrs. Laoxi's kitchen table. The lid was open. Inside the box was a folded piece of yellowed paper, a single dried frangipani flower from 35 years ago, and a small black and white photograph of his mother at 22, standing beside a much younger Uncle Ding. Both of them smiling. And underneath the photograph in the box, almost hidden, the corner of another piece of paper. Jack zoomed in. The corner of the paper read, Hong, Hong, Shi, Qi, Xi en Jing, Ji, Xi en Ji, Ji en Jing, Zi. A marriage contract, drafted 35 years ago, never signed. Jack's phone vibrated again. A new message from his mother. Con. Ah. There are some things even Bok Ding does not know. We will talk when you come up next weekend. Bring Tu Tien. Bring lytyeuca. There are some things she needs to hear too. Jack stared at the screen. If this story has held you, hit subscribe and turn on the bell. Part 2 drops in 3 days, and what Jack's mother is going to say to Lytutien about a frangipani tree, about a marriage that almost was, and about a name nobody has spoken in 35 years. None of us are ready for it. I will see you there.